Well, a major earthquake in Syria and Turkey has claimed over 5,000 lives, and the death toll is rising. But here is the thing that I am weary of seeing already in just the first 24 hours is virtue signaling about campaign donations or donations towards the Syrian people, unless they are coupled with a demand for the West to lift sanctions against Syria so that the country can actually recover. We can say nice things on Twitter. Justin Trudeau has committed some aid and said he's very sad and devastated about the earthquakes that have devastated everyone's loved ones, and Canada stands ready to provide assistance. Well, that's so nice, but Canada supported terrorism in Syria and devastating sanctions. So this is a good time to remind you that the U.S. and Canada and their Western partners has imposed what many call sanctions of mass destruction on Syria for decades. Now, last week we spoke at length about why. Why does the West attack Syria so acutely? We discussed that, when we discussed the United Nations sort of BS report about chemical weapons attacks, I refer you to that piece. To sum up, the U.S. does not want secular Arab nationalism to take hold in those regions, and they want U.S. interests to profit from the business in the Middle East. And Syria's leaders want Arab independence. Those are conflicting goals. That's why these sanctions are still crippling the Syrian economy and will continue to do so no matter how hard the region tries to recover from this devastation. Now, in December of 2003, George Bush sanctioned Syria unless they withdrew support for Hezbollah and Palestinians. The sanctions include bans on exports of military equipment and civilian goods that could be used for military equipment, so basically everything. And it also included a ban on U.S. exports to Syria other than food and medicine. Now, Stephen Goins is a reporter who's done a lot of work in this region. His book, Washington's Long War on Syria, just lays out exactly how devastating these have been. These sanctions against Syria. In October 2011, the New York Times reported that the Syrian economy was buckling under the pressure of sanctions by the West. By the spring of 2012, sanctions-induced financial hemorrhaging had forced Syrian officials to stop providing education, healthcare, and other essential services in some parts of the country. By 2016, U.S. and EU economic sanctions on Syria were causing huge suffering among ordinary Syrians and preventing the delivery of humanitarian aid, according to a leaked UN internal report. The report revealed that aid agencies were unable to obtain drugs and equipment for hospitals because of sanctions, preventing foreign firms from conducting commerce with Syria. The sanctions resembled the economic warfare that Washington had waged on Arab nationalist Iraq in the 90s. Those sanctions, as we've seen, destroyed the golden age the Arab nationalists had brought to the country. Patrick Cockburn wrote that the U.S. and EU sanctions resembled the Iraqi sanction regime and were an economic siege on Syria. Well, that continues. And in fact, when the same thing happened in Iraq, and we knew that those sanctions of mass destruction were killing people, at the time, U.S. Secretary of State Madeleine Albright said that those dead Iraqis were worth it.
Yeah, they were. That was fine. We looked at the numbers and we thought, all those dead Iraqi children, it was worth it.
Right.
Those were Madeleine Albright's words. And then they celebrated her at her funeral. They had a big, celebration. Bill Clinton arrived, like Barack Obama. All the warmongers show up.
Basically she's saying, these people's lives, brown lives, were worth it to stop secular Arab nationalism, which we don't want because we have conflicting financial interests.
Right. Yeah. If they are self-sufficient, if they have their own means through oil, and they are taken care of, that is an affront to us in the West.
And as Stephen Goins, writer of this book I just shared, points out, it's easy for us to say because no U.S. citizen or Wall Street banker ever lost their life from these sanctions, period. Now, Aaron Monte is a journalist who specializes on Syria, and he pointed this out on Twitter. In 2019, senior U.S. official Dana Stroul bragged that the U.S. was destroying Syria's economy as a means to an end. Listen.
The rest of Syria, though, is rubble. And what the Russians want and what Assad wants is economic reconstruction. And that is something that the United States can basically hold a card on via the international financial institutions and our cooperation with the Europeans. So we argued that absent behavioral changes by the Assad regime, we should hold the line on preventing reconstruction aid and technical expertise from going back into Syria.
Okay.
Can you believe that?
So I'm going to hold this as a pawn, as a card. Go ahead.
I was going to say, that's what really frustrates me is how people, they don't understand that sanctions also kill people. So it's like when they say, we're just going to put sanctions on them, it's almost like they're like, don't worry, we're not going to put boots on the ground. We're only going to sanction them. But like, if you look at like how many people die from that, what's the difference?
Well, I mean, as Vanessa Beeley reports, look, the sanctions are crushing. So they can't get oil, they can't get gas. To fill and get some petrol for their cars, it costs hundreds of dollars, and they only make about $27 a month. So these sanctions literally are killing people where they can't heat their homes.
Well, at this point now, think about the
inhumane.
medical supplies that they need that will be sanctioned.
Right.
Go ahead, David, please.
I was just saying it's actually more inhumane than actual boots on the ground. If you think about it, because like, you're basically like starving somebody of things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it really is it really is reminiscent of what somebody said earlier, like a siege on Syria. And it's like a classic medieval castle siege. And what you didn't go into the castle and kill everybody in it. What you did was you surrounded the castle and then let them starve to death.
Yeah.
Yes.
And that's exactly what these sanctions are. They are just a modernized version of the classic castle siege.
That is actually how the Portuguese,
Yeah, they cut them off. You cut them off. You cut off all their food supplies. They all get disease. Like all sorts of horrible diseases break out inside the castle walls.
That's how the Portuguese seized Lisbon from the Moors, is they closed them in the summer, and it was hot, and it was a drought.
Yeah.
And then they
just waited, and then they're like, okay, we'll take our castle back now.
Yeah. Now, Justin Trudeau just today says that the Canadian government will provide $10 million in immediate aid to the people of Turkey and Syria and continue to provide support as the situation evolves. I would be very interested in tracking that money, given that the sanctions are still in place. Journalist Eva Bartlett says, we all know by now that any assistance, she's Canadian, and also specializes in this region. She says any assistance that the government of Canada provides will go to terrorists in Idlib, not Syrian civilians, especially considering that the West supports al-Nusra, which is in the conflict between the Assad regime and
I would say the Assad government.
The Assad government, okay.
We call them in the West the regime. We want the Assad regime.
Let's use administration,
because
sure.
It's been so implanted in people's heads that it just flows off our tongues sometimes. I catch myself saying it too, the Assad regime. It's like, wait a minute.
Because
is it the Biden regime?
Sure, yes.
Right? I mean, so
it is.
It's the Assad government.
Okay, sure.
Let's call it the Assad government.
Okay, in the fight between the al-Nusra, which is the religious faction that wants to implement harsh Islamic law in this region, and has been uprising against the government there. The United States supports them, and al-Nusra is actually a faction of Al-Qaeda or ISIS. Mm-hmm. And so, yes, Canada and the United States do absolutely support terrorism in Syria. And so, it would be interesting to see how much of this aid that Western politicians give lip service to will actually reach anybody who needs it, which again is why I'm going to get really irritated if I see people on, Twitter saying, oh my God, my heart, here's a GoFundMe page. Like, do you know if it will get there? How about what we should be saying right now as Westerners is lift these sanctions so that we actually can help people in this region if that is our goal. So Russia is doing that, though. Right now, they are not going to wait around for sanctions to lift. Here are some images, videos of the Russian Foreign Ministry. They sent this out on their Telegraph channel, that they are sending emergency aid workers to this region immediately because they're kind of sanctions buddies, Right. Russia's sanctioned, Syria's sanctioned. Well, they can work together. And
so they show up immediately to help. Well, here we go with cadaver dogs and search dogs trying to help and get people out of this rubble. Go ahead.
I was thinking earlier, like, imagine if all the sanctioned countries would unite. Like, we would be screwed.
Yeah.
I feel like that slowly is happening.
Look at the BRICS nations. Yeah, just look at what's happening, right? And The problem is that unless you are of a certain level of means, like Russia, that you are almost self-sufficient, it's very difficult. I mean, Africa has just been under constant sanctions and control by the West. And so it's almost impossible if you don't have the wherewithal, the industrial capacity to get up to speed, to get oil and gas, to actually start the fossil fuel development, to have your own industrial revolution. You're under their thumb. That's exactly what's happening here. So people in the chat were like, what? We've been funding Al-Qaeda? Yeah, we have. We've been doing this for years. And this is like the Washington Post in 2015, talking about the CIA effort in Syria with large funding cuts, billions of dollars that we were funding ISIS and Al-Qaeda rebels.
This really ramped up during the Obama administration, when the Obama administration wanted to call out the Assad government as a regime and supported a government uprising. Now, the Assad regime did fight back, as most governments do, against any uprising, and the United States and Western allies took a side against the religious extremists, al-Nusra, which do have a direct connection to Al-Qaeda.
Yeah, of course. And so
they are the
what's
franchise.
amazing is that the money and the weapons that we've funneled into Syria, into the hands of Al-Qaeda, have now wound up on the battlefield in Ukraine. Like these very same Syrian Al-Qaeda operatives that we've funneled and funded for years are fighting in Ukraine on the part of the Ukrainian army side. So yes, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, these guys we've been absolutely keeping in business for many, many years.
Now, the U.S. is in Syria, too. They already were there illegally because the Syrian government absolutely does not want them in that region. And again, as Aaron Mate points out, the U.S. military occupies 1/3 of Syria. I didn't realize it was that big. Stealing its oil and wheat. Combined with the U.S. sanctions, this military occupation deprives Syria of the fuel it needs to power vehicles and machines. Meaning, like, how can you clean stuff up without vehicles? How can you run ambulances, right? How can you run a hospital? This, he points out, will make it even more difficult to rescue people trapped under the rubble. So my take on this, I do very much recommend this book, Washington's Long War on Syria, because I think this puts into relief the fact that these crushing sanctions have been in place. There is no point saying nice words on Twitter about helping if you do not support lifting of these sanctions and getting out of Syria. Maybe you can do better by asking your local politician to stop this rather than sending a GoFundMe that you're not at all guaranteed will make its way through these sanctions.
Right. Like, that's great that you're putting out a press release. We stand with the Syrian people and the Turkish people. But actually, hey, why don't you stop and actually vote against sanctions and remove the sanctions that are crippling and crushing these people? Smart idea. I love that. We've got more news to get to.
I would like to argue. Like to argue real quick against, like, Aaron Mate, where he says that the U.S. military is stealing the oil in Syria. When you look at the footage, I know we played it like several or like a year ago or so, but we've been covering as we've been covering this. But we're there protecting their oil.
Oh, yes.
And we're making sure it goes to people that know how to use it and what to properly do with it, which just happens to be us. But if it wasn't just us, we're just there protecting it. That's all we're doing. Yeah. We're not stealing.
We're just guarding it, protecting it, because you don't know how to use your own oil. So we invade your country, we block it off, cordon it off, and then we steal it and send it back to the United States.
Well, contrary to most belief, Syria is not an oil-rich place compared to most Middle Eastern countries, but it is centrally located in a place where they do not want unification of oil-producing countries in this region.
Thank you so much for watching this segment here at Redacted. We are live every day at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, trying to share the stories that the mainstream media will not cover. You should also come over and join our community of Redacted Rebels over at redacted.inc. That's our private locals community where we can share exclusive content that we simply cannot share here on YouTube. Come over and join the rebellion together right now by going to redacted.inc. We'll see you next time.